before Lesa and James became an award-winning author and illustrator team, before they were mom and dad to 4 children, before they were college students, they were young people interested in expressing themselves in words and pictures, exploring ideas that intrigue them and that are sure to intrigue young readers as well. Lesa was born and raised in a town outside of Boston, where her mom encouraged her interest in writing by giving her a diary, and that was an interest encouraged by her teachers. James was born in and raised in rural North Carolina and was always intrigued by illustration, moving images on television and movies, photography, and other visual images. I think James Ransome said it best. He said, "What makes illustrating and writing," I added that, "books so exciting is that because each book has a special voice, so the approach to each one is different." It is truly my pleasure to introduce you to Lesa Cline-Ransome and James Ransome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was really fun. Good morning. So it's a pleasure to be here. You guys look so fresh-faced and it's because you walked over here? Was it cold? It's kind of cold? Well, we came in from New York. James came in from Syracuse, where yesterday they got about a foot of snow. Yeah, so this is nothing. This is like, it feels like a summer day outside. This is nothing. So we're gonna get started, and we're going to take you in, we're gonna show you our presentation. We're gonna show you where we live and work, how we create books together. We're gonna introduce you to our family, a very special member of our family. And we're gonna have time for questions. James is gonna do a little drawing with you. And that's it, we'll get started because we don't have a whole lot of time, but we wanna get started. And we'll start right at the top and at the beginning.
So we're gonna start off talking about where we started doing artwork and writing. This is North Carolina. This is where I was born. I was born in a small town in North Carolina called Rich Square. This is actually downtown Rich Square. There are 2 traffic lights there. That's how small this town is. So almost everyone knew everyone. Next. This is me as a little kid. Thank you. And next. Also, and this is where I was actually born, in this building here. And growing up in North Carolina, I always wanted to be an artist. But there were not a lot of artists in the town that I grew up in. There were no museums to go into to see artwork. We didn't have art. Art wasn't even taught in the schools I attended. And there were no museums or galleries to go into. So my first art teachers came from this building here, this pharmacy. And they were comic books. So I grew up reading and looking at a lot of comic books and copying the art in comic books. Mad Magazine was also a big influence on my drawing. I would make up little stories about my friends and I would staple the paper together and pass these booklets out in class. So I taught myself a lot about drawing before I was had any professional training. And then I moved away from North Carolina. I moved to New Jersey. And this is me in high school. And this Bergenfield High School had an amazing art program there. They had actually a wing dedicated to the arts. Next. And that's where I got a lot of my first art teachers and first art instructions came from that school in New Jersey.
So I grew up in Malden, Massachusetts, and I grew up there, and here I am in kindergarten. So I grew up there with my parents, who were both nurses, and an older brother and sister. And unlike James, I was really fortunate. I grew up there with a mom who loved to read. And so from a very early age, she exposed me to books. She shared books with me. And we spent a lot of our time at the Malden Public Library, where we would go each weekend and just check out stacks and stacks and stacks of books. And we would go home, and I would spend my weekend just reading. And I would often get lost in the pages of books about girls and adventures. And I loved reading stories about all types of people that took me kind of around the world, and I would get lost in adventures. I loved stories of Pippi Longstocking, Judy Blume. I really loved any story about Laura Ingalls Wilder and Little House on the Prairie. I also loved stories about girls who had to overcome adversity and obstacles, stories like Diary of Anne Frank. James and I met when we both went to college. So he, was from North Carolina, I'm from Massachusetts. We both went to college in Brooklyn, New York at Pratt Institute. We met during our sophomore year at a Purple Rain party, which was all the music of Prince. You guys know who Prince is, right? Yes, yes. Sometimes no one knows who Prince is, and it scares me, yes. So yes, we went at a Purple Rain party, and we have been dating ever for so many years. So I was 19 when we met, James was 22. We've been married now for 27 years. Let's get a round of applause for 27 years, right? And so now we live in the Hudson Valley region of New York, which is about 2 miles north of New York City.
2 hours.
Yeah, I said 2 hours.
I think it's 2 miles.
No, we don't live. I know we don't live 2 miles. And we live here with our family. And this is our family. I love to put this picture in because over the summer, somebody started a magazine in our town called Living Rhinebeck, and they asked us to be on the cover. And our kids said, why would anyone want us to be on the cover of a magazine? But we posed for the cover of the magazine, and so I'm going to introduce you to our children. Our oldest is Jamie. Jamie's 24 years old. She works as an assistant curator at a gallery in Syracuse, New York. Our next is 22-year-old Maya, and she works as a graphic designer in New York City. And then there's Malcolm. Malcolm is 21, and he's a senior industrial design student at Syracuse University. And then our youngest is Layla, and Layla is 17 years old, and she'll be going off to college in the fall. But our baby of the family is Nola. Is she the cute? And I know that I'm not supposed to say this. I'm a mom, and it's not right. But Nola's my favorite. She is my absolute favorite child. She's 9 years old, and she's just the sweetest thing ever.
Is it because she doesn't talk back?
It could be. It could be that she doesn't talk back, and she never breaks curfew, and she's just lovely. So in our house, we both work at home, and this is my office space. Basically, as a writer, I just have a desk, and I'm surrounded by books. It's where I sit, I research, I read, and I work on my computer.
This is the outside version of view of my studio. I like to take you guys inside and show you where I work. As you come in through the side door here, you see there's flat files for different projects I'm working on. This is my table. I keep these boards I staple my paper to, and these slots here on the table, and other art supplies are kept there as well. And these boxes here are projects that I'm working on, usually future projects I'm working on. This is my drawing desk. Next to the drawing desk, I have pastels, pencils, all these things are used to help make the artwork. I have a wall in my studio where you can actually see the entire book as it's being put together. So this is from a book I finished recently. This is my desk. This is where I have my 2 printers, and this is where I do the business side of being an illustrator. Here's my library. Here I keep my book collection. Lots of reference and research books are in this area here. Here we have chapter books. Music starts here and go down. Children's books are in this section here, and my books are in this section down here. This is what it looks like when I'm working on a project. I usually work at a light box. Almost all my drawings are done at a light box. And this is an example of all the materials that I would have around me for research and for referencing. This is a mural I did in my studio for a library in North Carolina. I actually assembled these panels on the wall here and painted the picture. Then I took it down to North Carolina where it was reassembled there. And this is the outside of a children's room, and doors would go here and here. This is my easel. This is where I would sit and paint. My palette is over to my left.
Okay. So people often ask, where do you get your ideas for your books? So we get ideas from all around us, but mainly we get ideas from things that we love or that we're interested in. James and I both love sports. And now, James warned me I probably shouldn't have used this particular photo. I probably should have used something a little more neutral, but as you guys know, I'm from Boston, so I put this one in. Let's quickly flip through. Let's quickly flip through this. So anyhow, the first book we did was the book Satchel Paige, and so we love stories about athletes. I was an athlete in school, and I do love stories about athletes and how they've had to push past their own physical and mental boundaries and to achieve things. And so we love the story of Satchel Paige, the Negro League pitcher, and so we created the book Satchel Paige. Of course, there's a story of Major Taylor, the world champion cyclist in the early 1900s, and so we created the book Major Taylor, Champion Cyclist. Then there was the book about Pele, the soccer player. And we created the book Young Pele, Soccer's First Star. This book was especially nice for me because our son Malcolm, when he was 9 years old, posed for the part of Pele. And James and I love history, and we love like quilts. Quilts are kind of a combination of history and art combined, and so we created 2 books about quilts, Quilt Alphabet and then Quilt Counting. And then we also love music and dancing, and so we have a lot of books about music and dancing and jazz. So there was Mozart, and the story of the jazz legend Louis Armstrong, Just a Lucky So-and-so. Benny Goodman and Teddy Wilson taking the stage as the first black and white jazz band in history. My Story, My Dance, which is the story of the choreographer for Alvin Ailey Dance Troupe, Robert Battle. And people often ask, have your kids ever inspired a book? And for a while we said no, they really haven't. But when they were younger, we used to go crazy with trying to get them to wash their hands. So James came up with this great idea to write a book about hand washing and about germs. So the book Germs was inspired by our kids who never washed their hands. It drove us crazy. And of course, we're often inspired by the stories from our own family and from history, and from the history of African Americans. And this is actually a photograph of my grandfather when he was in college in 1925. And I'm really very interested in how the obstacles and the challenges that African Americans faced in trying to get an education. And so that kind of led me to trying to find out more about those struggles and the journeys that African Americans kind of how they tried to get an education in really difficult times. And that led me to the story of Frederick Douglass. And so I wrote the book Words Set Me Free. All of my books start with research. And so I usually start at my local library, which is here in Rhinebeck. and so this is my library here in Rhinebeck. And so when I was writing the book, Satchel Paige, I actually knew nothing about baseball. I knew very, very little. So I had to go to a library, and I took out tons and tons of books about baseball. I went to baseball games. I watched videos about baseball. I learned as much as I could about the subject. Of course, I go online. I do internet searches and research there. I also look at photographs for inspiration, and I watch movies. But I think the most interesting part of research is when I'm able to go out of my house and go to living history museums. Here I write a lot of books about slavery, and so here I was able to visit a slave cabin. And this is also an example of a slave cabin. Of course, I want to see how slaves would have lived. This is probably not a great example. Here they have a bed and they have hooks and things like that and a wooden floor. Most slaves actually didn't sleep in a bed. They slept on dirt floors. So this is probably not the most realistic picture or portrait of how slaves lived, but it is one example of a slave cabin. This is from Carter's Grove Plantation in Virginia, another example of a slave cabin. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we wrote the book before there was Mozart, we visited Versailles in France to see, when he performed for the King and Queen of France, we had to go to see where the King and Queen of France lived and what it would have felt like for a young man to go and perform at a castle. I start by taking notes. So as I'm doing my research, I'm taking notes and I'm getting a sense of how I want to tell the story. So if I wanted to write the story of Nola, the first thing I would do is I would start my research. I would gather up as much information as I could about St. Bernards. I would find out, what their habits were like, what they like to do, how much do they eat, what is their routine, how do they interact with their families. And I would probably find out that St. Bernards are very much family dogs. They love spending time with their families. They love going on long walks and being outdoors in the cold. And that after a very long walk, they like to take very long naps. And that they love being outdoors in the snow. They often love multitasking by playing in the snow, eating snow, and napping in the snow. That they make the world's worst watchdogs. They often fall asleep on the job. And that at the end of a long day, they love to take a nap on the couch. So these are the things I might put into a story if I were writing the story of Nola. So I start by first, kind of like James might do, I have a sketch. This is my rough draft. I just start writing down ideas, how I think the story might start to look. It's my rough draft. Then I sit at my computer and I type it out, my first kind of sketch, and that's my manuscript. I rewrite it again and again and again. I read it to James, I read it to my kids, I read it to Nola, and I start to tighten it, I get feedback, I rewrite it several times. I send it then off to my editor, hoping that she'll love it, thinking, of course, it's the best. I've written it 10 times, of course, I think it's perfect, I send it to her, and usually what I get back is something that looks like this, with tons of comments, changes, questions, and then I rewrite it some more, and until I get the final copy. I make more and more changes, and then that final copy is what goes back to the publisher, and then about a year or two later, it goes off to the illustrator, which for the most part is James.
So I get the story, and of course, it's been a few years now since Lesa has written the story, so I, of course, have to reread the story. Sometimes I have questions for her about different parts of the story, and at this point, she's probably written 2 or 3 other stories and doesn't remember all the details. So sometimes she has to share her research again with me. We talk about it, and I start making sketches. So there's basically 7 steps I go through to illustrate a book. I have a sketchbook like this, and in this sketchbook I do thumbnail sketches. These are small little sketches. I do 10, 20 thumbnail sketches for every page you see in a book. I'm also doing research at the same time. So Lesa has her research, but now I'm looking for visual research. I need to know what that wagon's going to look like, what that car is going to look like, what type of clothes the people are wearing. Few different things than what Lesa is probably interested in as she's writing the story. I have picture files, pictures I've taken, pictures I've found from different places. I've collected over the years. So if I need pictures, for example, of cows, I have tons of pictures of cows I can choose from. I have tons of books in the studio, as I showed you before, books on different types of animals, horses, frogs, all sorts of things, pond life, different types of birds. I also enjoy going to living museums, as Lesa said, and there you get to see people living in the situation or the time period that we want to, that I'm illustrating. In this case, with the book Robert Battle, I actually had to go to the dance studio to see the Alvin Ailey dancers perform. And I took lots of pictures there. Then I come back to my studio. I also use Google searches as well. And I collect movies, magazines, books on the topics is also collected. I put everything in folders on my computer, page 2, 3, 4, 5, et cetera, et cetera. And then I make an actual dummy of the book. This is the same size the book is going to be, with the same amount of pages in it. And now I'm going to take those sketches that I was making before, and I'm going to sketch those out. I'm going to sketch those out in my dummy book. Then I'm going to take the words that Lesa has written, I'm going to cut those words up, I'm going to tape those words down next to my artwork. So now we have basically a dummy or a mock-up of the book, what it's going to look like once it's all printed. And these are some of the sketches from there. Sometimes I actually have to bring in people to pose for me. These are my models. They're going to become my reference. In this case, I brought in Donald Cruz. He played the part of the father. And he's a famous illustrator for children's books. And this is a neighbor's son. And I photographed them in our house and in my studio, acting out different scenes. And then I put all those together using tracing paper and my light box. I put all those together. You can, if you look very close, you can see how I basically patchwork these drawings together to get exactly what I need. And then I do the final drawing. It's transferred from a tracing paper to watercolor paper or other boards I may use, depending on what medium I'm working in. And this is what a final drawing would look like. And like this. And like this. And then I'm going to start painting those drawings. Like this. And then I just start adding more and more color to it, different levels. I also go back in at some point and start drawing. And this is what, then I have to put the stripe on his shirt, the plaid on his shirt. And that's the final painting. And a final painting like this will probably take about 3 to 4 days to illustrate.
So research, you can see, is a huge part of what we do when we're creating books together. But what I like most about research is that research often takes you in really unexpected places. So when I was doing the research for the book, Words Set Me Free, I was doing a lot of research on Frederick Douglass. And so when I was researching Frederick Douglass, I was learning a lot about his life and about the time period. And what I discovered was that when he escaped slavery, he escaped to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where he worked on whaling ships. So when I discovered there was also an African-American whaling ship captain, the first one of his time. It was in the 1700s. And I started thinking about writing a book about a whaling ship captain, or about writing a book about whaling in general. Then I started thinking about writing a book about whale watching, and how hundreds of years ago we would hunt whales, but how now we actually go whale watching. So I decided, after trying several drafts, that maybe I could combine those two stories, whale watching versus whale hunting. And I came up with the book Whale Trails Before and Now, story about a young girl and her father who owned a whale watching boat, and comparing it with the story of how many, the many people who 300 years ago would whale hunt, and many of those people were escaped slaves and free blacks. And that book was Whale Trails Before and Now. I also learned a lot about how African Americans struggled to get an education when reading and writing was illegal, especially during slavery. So it was very difficult for them to learn to read and write, but they still sought out an education. That book led to Freedom School and the story Light in the Darkness, a story about how slaves learned in secret. And that's a story, that book is in particular is a story of Rosa and her mother and how they would sneak out late at night from the slave cabins and learned to read. And of course, it led to the story Harriet Tubman. And Harriet Tubman has always been a hero of mine, and James had this idea of writing a story about Harriet Tubman, but instead of a traditional biography, we would start maybe from the story of Harriet Tubman as she's an older woman and look back on her life and all the things that she had accomplished. The research also helped both of us to try to understand that she had lived many lives. We know her as the conductor of the Underground Railroad, but what we didn't know was that she had led many other lives. In addition to being a conductor on the Underground Railroad, she had led many other lives. So that led to the story Before She Was Harriet. And I'm going to read to you now from Before She Was Harriet. Here she sits, an old woman, tired and worn, her legs stiff, her back achy. But before wrinkles formed and her eyes failed, before she reached her twilight years, she could walk for miles and see clearly under a sky lit only with stars. Before she was an old woman, she was a suffragist, a voice for women who had none, in marriages, in courts, in voting booths. Before her voice became soft and raspy, it was loud and angry, rising above injustice. Before she was a suffragist, she was General Tubman, rising out of the fog, armed with courage, strong in the face of rebels and planters and overseers as they watched fields burn and bridges fall and 700 slaves stop chopping and start running, to a woman who ferried them to freedom on the Combahee River turned River Jordan. Before she was General Tubman, she was a Union spy, carrying secrets across battlefields to soldiers fighting in the Civil War for President Lincoln to end slavery. Before she was a Union spy, she was a nurse, caring for those hit with bullets and hatred and fear, tending to them with bandages and words in the bloody dirt of Southern soil. Before she was a nurse, she was Aunt Harriet, daughter of Ben and Rit, who helped her parents flee their master and find their way through woods and streams to the safety of Canada and a new home in the North. Before she was Aunt Harriet, she was Moses, a conductor on an underground railroad with no trains and no tracks, just passengers traveling to freedom, up north, through swamps, past slave catchers, across rivers, under the cover of night. Seeking the promised land for her people, led by dreams and God and faith, a wisp of a woman with the courage of a lion. Before she was Moses, she was Minty of Maryland, of one slave owner and then others who worked her, punished her with lashes, broke her back, but not her spirit. Before she was Minty, she was Araminta, a young girl taught by her father to read the woods and the stars at night, readying for the day she'd leave behind slavery along with her name and pick a new one, Harriet, and remember her days as a suffragist, as a general, as a spy, as a nurse, as Aunt Harriet, as Moses, as a conductor, as Minty, as Araminta, who dreamed of living long enough to one day be old, stiff and achy, tired and worn and wrinkled and free.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Does anyone have questions for us? Questions?
Yes. Question was, how many words
many-
has Lesa written in her entire life?
Oh, that would be really hard. I would say each book is about, 1,500 words. And so far, how good are you at math? You good at math? You good? Okay. So I've written about 20 books. Each book is at least 1,500 words. Think about it. Come back to me with that. Okay?
In the corner, yes. Most successful.
In all of our experience in writing books, what is the thing we feel we're most successful at? What about, do you want to start?
He said writing.
You said in writing?
Yeah. Oh.
Thank you. Yeah, so now you can go first.
I'm probably, I'm very proud. I did some murals for some museums. So I'm very proud of those murals I've done for museums.
I would say I'm most proud that of writing different types of books. So, I started off writing a biography, and then I've written, now Harriet's kind of more of a lyrical verse, and then I recently wrote a novel. So it's nice to be able to write different types of stories, different genres. Thank you, yes.
Yes.
Have we ever written a book and then we realize we mess up on the last
Picture. Yeah.
last
Yeah.
picture? Or,
Yeah.
Well,
I think it's my question.
go ahead.
No, you don't get frustrated with making a mistake in a picture. Sometimes mistakes is actually what you're looking for. It can actually make a picture better, believe it or not. You learn to work with your mistakes, and you know how to correct things. So it doesn't stop you from getting the image that you're looking for.
Sometimes, though, like editors or art directors, you might do a thing and then a picture, and then they might say, I don't know, we may want to change it. So sometimes changes are made at the end of a project.
Yes. Favorite book that I've written. Now I mostly illustrate. I have written 3 books, actually 3 books that are published. My 4th book is in production now. It'll be out early next year. So I would say probably my most recent book, the one that's not out yet, is my most I'm the one I enjoy the most.
I love Harriet. I loved Harriet.
Yes. What type of dog do we have? Saint Bernard.
Don't you think she's adorable?
Yes.
Isn't she adorable? Yeah. She's adorable.
Just like the movie.
Beethoven.
Beethoven, yeah. You ever seen the movie Beethoven? You ever seen Beethoven? Oh. Drool. Lots of drool. Everywhere. You need an umbrella in the house.
Not really.
Okay, someone in the back. Young man in a jacket, yes. No grown-up books.
No grown-up.
We don't like grown-up books. Only books for young people. Young man. No book about Nola.
I did write a book about my dog, but I haven't been able to get it published yet. I'm hoping that I will be soon. Yes.
Yes. My favorite book that I've illustrated, I have 3 favorite books that I've illustrated. One's called Uncle Jed's Barbershop, Satchel Paige, and Burr Rabbit are my 3 favorite books that I've illustrated. So if you can write number 8, you can draw, right? Super Bowl was last week, and Super Bowl's football is over, and baseball is in, right?